Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Explainer. I'm so glad you're joining us. It's Saturday, May 2nd, 2026. Tonight, we're tracking a fascinating and frankly critical series of interconnected global macro trends. Basically, what we're seeing is the definitive closing of the curtain on the era of cheap capital. So, let's just dive straight into the geopolitical and economic fractures that are actively shaping our entirely new reality. Here's a quick look at tonight's top stories. We're going to kick things off with the diplomatic friction we're seeing in the Middle East, followed by a major global economic downgrade and a deeply divided Federal Reserve. After that, we'll unpack AI's massive pivot to nuclear energy, the permanent rewiring of global supply chains, and finally wrap up with what this new high-cost reality actually means for you.
All right, first up on the global desk, Middle East diplomatic friction. We're currently navigating a dangerous stalemate backed by some seriously tightening sanctions.
Notice the deep contrast here. On the surface, sure, hostilities are technically paused under this really fragile conditional ceasefire. But if you look just beneath that, maritime friction is absolutely surging. The U.S. Treasury literally just slapped fresh sanctions on 3 Iranian exchanges, and the White House has issued severe warnings against paying any sort of tolls in the Strait of Hormuz. So, the guns might be quiet for now, but that financial chokehold, it is absolutely tightening.
And just to put this into perspective, 95%. That is the staggering volume of pre-conflict traffic currently completely shut out of the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, we're looking at a functional blockade here. And with both sides testing the limits of this stalemate every single day, the risk of a sudden, unpredictable military flare-up remains dangerously high. Which brings us to our next story. The global economic downgrade. Because that intense diplomatic tension, it's casting a long, dark shadow right over the global economy. Let's look at the latest downgrade. 3.1%. That's the IMF's officially downgraded global growth projection for 2026. What we are witnessing right now is a true structural fracturing of the real economy, and it's being driven by the most severe energy supply disruption the world has faced since the 1970s. It's a massive shock to the system.
And this dynamic perfectly illustrates a dangerous new trend we're calling fiscal dominance. Check out how global defense spending is surging by an average of 2.7% of GDP. That's what's pushing those green arrows upward. But in response, essential social spending, those red arrows, well, it's being completely crowded out and pushed down. These skyrocketing defense costs are leaving some deep, permanent scars on long-term economic resilience all around the world.
Pivoting over to the finance desk now, a divided Federal Reserve. We're looking at a central bank struggling to navigate incredibly sticky inflation.
And here's the root of the problem. 19%. That massive surge in global energy prices is the exact reason Chair Jerome Powell and the Fed have essentially been forced to pause rates right in that 3.5 to 3.75% range. This energy shock is hitting emerging markets the absolute hardest, and it's keeping inflation stubbornly anchored exactly where central bankers do not want it. But honestly, perhaps the biggest story out of the central bank right now is this internal rift. We saw 4 dissenting members vote against the Fed's forward guidance. To give you some context, that is the highest number of dissents we have seen since 1992. It's a huge deal, signaling some really deep, fundamental disagreements behind closed doors over exactly how to handle this crisis.
And it gets even more complicated. $315 trillion. Just let that number sink in. That is the staggering size of the global debt pool waiting for incoming Fed Chair Kevin Warsh on May 15th. Warsh is stepping into what is basically a wartime economic environment, and he's going to be tasked with managing this absolutely astronomical debt while simultaneously fighting relentless price hikes. No easy feat for sure. Meanwhile, over in the tech sector, AI's nuclear energy pivot. The infrastructure supercycle is officially here.
So the explosive growth of the new agentic AI era is slamming into a massive physical bottleneck, sparking a total infrastructure supercycle. As you can see, data centers are projecting a 14% compound annual growth rate through 2030, which is going to require a massive 200 gigawatts of power. But here is the critical bottleneck. Wait times to connect to the traditional power grid have now ballooned up to 8 years in some places. Hyperscalers simply cannot wait that long. Because of that gridlock, we're seeing a fundamental paradigm shift. Tech leadership is really no longer just about software innovation. Today, it is all about energy security. So to bypass those volatile, completely overloaded power grids, major tech firms are aggressively pivoting to independent on-site microreactors. Think about that. Nuclear energy is literally becoming the new backbone of AI. It's wild to see.
All right, let's look at the vital arteries of global commerce, rewiring global supply chains. We're talking about a permanent detour.
Here is a number that really tells the story. 20%. That is the volume of the world's seaborne oil and LNG that has been permanently removed from traditional routing. So that crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, it's no longer just a temporary delay. It has fundamentally and structurally altered global logistics for good.
The whole logistics paradigm has shifted entirely. That Cape of Good Hope detour, fully integrated reality now, adding up to 20 days to Asia-Europe voyages. We've also seen the largest monthly freight rate increases in years. And because of all this, that famous just-in-time inventory model everybody loved, totally abandoned. Now, companies are paying massive premiums to stockpile regional buffers just to survive the day-to-day uncertainty.
So, what does this all mean? Let's get to our final segment, the new high-cost reality, synthesis and outlook. Let's connect the dots here. When you combine that Middle East friction, an energy shock, permanently rerouted supply chains, and the transition to a Kevin Warsh-led Federal Reserve, it all points to one definitive pivot. You should absolutely expect a hawkish, reform-minded Fed that will prioritize price stability over near-term growth. When you pair that with structurally higher supply chain costs, we are going to be living with higher for longer interest rates. The era of cheap capital, cheap energy, and predictable logistics is officially over.
The global architecture has fundamentally changed, and every single macro indicator points to a new high-cost baseline. So the question I'll leave you with tonight is this. The era of cheap capital is behind us. How will you adapt your strategy to survive this new high-cost reality? It's something to really think about. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Have a great night.